I'm XPLovecat, and I just finished running the 2.5-year campaign of Masks of Nyarlathotep with my players, and I set out to make videos that would be helpful for keepers and the videos that I would have wanted when I was trying to prepare for this campaign. There are lots of different forums and notes and bits and pieces here and there, but I really was looking for someone to walk me through what are the key things to pay attention to and the key tips to take away before running this campaign. So this video is for the keepers who know they're ready to dive right in. If you're not quite sure what Masks of Nyarlathotep is, or if you're not sure if it's right for your group, check out my spoiler-free review video, and that will give you a ton of great information. But for those who are ready to dive in, there will be a ton of spoilers moving forward, so be fair warned. How do I even begin to prepare this massive campaign? Well, here are some of my key tips for this stage. Well, the first thing I would say is I highly recommend getting the physical copies of these books. Sure, you can just buy the PDF and it's going to be cheaper, but I promise this is going to save you a lot of time and energy. And for me personally, reading the physical books was a lot more fun anyway. Now, when you first get your books, I would recommend you skim through the entire campaign. And I mean skim. Don't read every single word. I mean, there's a ton going on in this book, and you're not going to retain it anyway. So my best advice for you is to try and just get the basic understanding of the different location options. So for that, you go into the table of contents and look at what the different locations are and some of the key headings for each of those locations. You're going to skim quickly over kind of the setting information, spend a little bit of time learning the NPCs and the different cults per the location. You might want to get a pretty good understanding of the setup and the important people for the Carlisle expedition, and spend a bit of time on the grand conclusion chapter. But when it comes to some of the side scenarios, the details per the specific locations and buildings and the things inside of the different chapters, those can be skimmed for now. So let's talk a little bit about taking notes. I mean, there's a lot going on, and you're probably not going to be remembering things off the top of your head. So I would recommend taking your notes in OneNote. That's where I took all of my notes. It was organized all in the same place, and I was able to sub-chapter each of those notes so I could know specific things like NPCs, setting information, or just notes during play. Now, if you're interested in a specific OneNote tutorial, I have a video all about that and how I take notes in it. These notes are going to be taken during your specific location planning, which is going to happen the couple weeks before your session, depending on how much time you have to commit to it every day. But for me, I usually started 2 weeks before the session actually happened, so that it was pretty fresh in my mind, but that I had enough time to digest the information and plan for some unexpected things possibly. Next, I want to share with you some of the setup. So in addition to all this stuff, I would recommend getting 2 folders. One is for the players, so it's empty, you just hand it to them, and that's where they're going to store all of their handouts and notes throughout the campaign. The second is a folder for yourself. Any folder will do. And I'm going to kind of show you the mess that's inside. So let's talk about what you should print off. I know you have the physical copies, which is going to be super helpful, but for quick references that you're going to need pretty often, goes in the folder. Those things are a calendar, because that's going to tell you how they're progressing, and you will physically mark off the days that they're taking so you can keep track of everything that's happening. Also, I'd recommend circling whenever they enter a new location or leave a location, so you're keeping track of kind of the progress throughout the year. The next thing to print off is the timeline of key events. This is going to be in the book that you can print off, and it gives you the history of what led up to Jackson and Elias kind of reaching out to these different players. I did end up printing the travel times and clue diagrams, but honestly, I don't know if you really need this. I reference the clue diagrams from time to time when I needed to understand how things were connecting, but you don't really need to be keeping track of which ones your players have, marking things off. I didn't actively use those as much as I thought I would. I highly recommend printing off the Carlisle expedition principles. Those give you the key notes for all of the important people, and it's super helpful to keep everything everything straight in your head and a reminder of who everyone is. You can also take notes next to each of these different people during play if it helps you. All right, so you got all that printed out. The next thing I would recommend is Appendix C and D, which are the tomes and artifacts. Now, of course, this is in the book as well, but I didn't always have part 2 book with me, which is where these appendixes are located. So this was helpful. It also was cool because if a player actually found these books or artifacts, it was a pretty quick reference for me to pull it out, find where they were, and then find that specific artifact or book. Also writing notes on who has possession of these books, the major things that they're going through, more places for notes apparently. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with having those 2 appendixes printed out. So that is a highly recommended thing as well. Something I didn't print out, but I wish I would have, is the grand conclusion page on 621. So this page is one that you can mark off what your players are doing throughout the locations and will prep you for when you get to that final location. In addition to all this stuff, I have some of the handouts that my players ended up not finding, but it's a good location to keep your maps as well, your keeper maps, handouts, notes. So loose leaf paper is essential to have in here so you can quickly write down notes. Of course, I put them in the OneNote app if I have time to, but if we're in the middle of something or we're just going through some combat, loose leaf paper is essential for that. And note cards as well, which can help you kind of keep track of different things or give notes to your players. And the final what's in my folder are extra character sheets. So always be prepared to have another character sheet in case a player needs it. And maybe there's some player deaths that you want to make sure the next player is ready to go with their character. So this folder should get you in a good position of quick access things that are helpful for you. Everything else you can of course go to the physical books for. During play, I had OneNote open on my phone, so I was kind of juggling my phone, these different papers, and the physical books, but felt like that was manageable for the information that I needed to get to quickly. So let's talk about handouts. Of course, they provide all of the handouts printed for you, and it's on really nice paper and it looks great, but I'm kind of weird and I don't like disrupting or ruining these pages that came with the book. So instead, I decided to print out all of the handouts and just went to Office Max, printed everything out, cut it, and kind of was able to destroy it and make it more interesting looking. As an example, you're going to print out the handouts, and each of the handouts has a specific key number for what the clue is. That will be a lifesaver for you if you actually put it on the handout. That way you don't get confused or don't forget what clues are supposed to be where. As you can see, this is a newspaper article that I wanted to look a little bit more aged, so I went ahead and crumpled it up, roughened it up a bit, and made it more interesting than just a normal piece of paper that I would hand to my players. Another example of what you can do with handouts is something that's supposed to be written on notebook paper. Instead of printing it out, you could actually have a notebook piece of paper and write it out to make it more authentic. It's really up to you how much effort you want to put into the handouts, but I think it makes for a little bit more immersion and fun experience. Now I have to note, there is a kit that you can get with all the props. I personally didn't buy it, so I can't vouch for if it's good or not, but that is available if you don't want to spend the time actually making your handouts look nice. Let's talk about some additional resources you might need. Masks of Nyarlathotep have 2 books that have a ton of really great information in it. But some of the things that could be helpful is a Facebook group. They have one that's already created where a bunch of people who are running this campaign can ask each other questions and tell stories, and it was a really helpful resource for me. It's called the Masks of Nyarlathotep Keepers Support Group, and I will link it below in case you're interested. The other thing you might hear as you do some research and keep talking to different people is that there is a Masks companion book, which is not published by Chaosium. It was an independent publisher that went through an additional basically 600 pages to help with this campaign. Those are in during a prior edition where there wasn't as much depth to the campaign. But honestly, I felt like the 7th edition had plenty for me to grab onto and enough information for me to do a great job at being a keeper, so I didn't really find that I needed it. There were some parts that gave me some inspiration, and I'll share those throughout the location videos if I feel like they're relevant for enhancing your campaign, but otherwise, don't feel like you need to read an additional 600 pages just to be able to play this massive, great campaign. Let's talk a little bit about setting expectations with your players. So this is something that I think is really important so that everyone's on the same page on what they're really signing up for and what to expect during gameplay. So here are some of the key things that I told my players before we started playing. I first let them know pretty generically I was going to be running a 1920s campaign for Call of Cthulhu, and that I wasn't going to tell them the name of it so that they didn't go and get spoilers. This is something that you may or may not feel is necessary for your group, but for me it kind of helped mask, no pun intended, what was actually going on in the campaign and who the big bad was, at least until they got further in. The next part was level setting expectations of how much of a commitment this would be. So originally I told them it'd probably take about 2 years. It ended up taking 2.5, but letting them know that it was a pretty long haul. And so if they weren't interested in something like that, then that was perfectly fine and they might be better suited for a different table. In addition, I set the expectation right away that we would try to meet every other week pretty consistently, just so they know to prioritize it and make sure it is on their calendar. It's also important to let them know that there's a high chance that they will at least have one character that dies during their campaign. So I know some people get quite attached to their characters, which is understandable, but making sure that they know that that's a possibility is helpful so that they don't get caught off guard or too upset when one of their character dies. In addition to this, I actually had them start the campaign with 2 characters created. So just in case something happened, they were ready to go and had a character in reserve and we could keep playing right away. On the note of characters, they do have some pre-made characters in the campaign. However, I thought it was a lot more fun for the players to actually create their own characters. Of course, this will depend on your party, but it was more fun for them to have an experience of trying to connect their characters to why they wanted to go on expeditions and kind of have motivation there. When they're creating their characters, it is important to share some information with them about the general setup, but also the useful skills that will be really helpful during the campaign, which is listed in the Mask of Nyarlathotep book. So you're able to give them that information and give them a little bit of guidance on how to create their characters. Make sure they know they will need to take notes during this campaign. There is a lot of different clues and leads and people to keep track of. So taking notes is pretty much essential to be able to understand what's going on. And the final thing I told them is if at any point you're not having fun, but it's something that maybe I could do differently, please let me know so that I can adjust. Otherwise, if it turns out it's just not their type of game, they're welcome to stop playing because I just want people there who are having fun. And here's a pro tip of something that I did tell my players that you probably shouldn't because it makes the campaign way harder. I basically told them that in order to help roleplay, if your character dies or goes insane, any notes that you took during that time, they would have to throw them out and pretend like they didn't have the prior information from that character. But that I quickly learned that that was going to be way more complicated and actually detract from the fun because it's much harder to follow all the threads. So don't tell your players that, would not recommend, and quickly learn my lesson there. Let's get into the overall tips of when you're starting to plan the different locations. The first thing I would say is make sure you have a firm understanding of the main goals of each of the locations. When your players are getting distracted and going different ways, it is easy to lose sight of what exactly the main clues and the main things they want to get out of each location is. So in order to do this, I recommend reading the conclusion and reward section first for every single section. That way you start with that goal in mind of, okay, here are the key things that are important in this section, and it helps kind of condense what's going on in the location. Then once you have that firm understanding, you can go back to the beginning of the chapter and read through all the specifics, but now you have that point in your head of going back to these are really the main points and making sure you know when your players will be ready to move on to the next location. The next top tip I have for you is to look up photos of the different locations. It can be photos from the 1920s or even current photos to get a sense of the environment and the atmosphere atmosphere. That way you have a good idea of how to explain the setting to your characters and get them really immersed in the different locations. Because one of the cool parts about this campaign is each location feels a little bit different. Their environment and the people there are different. So making sure that you have a way to express that is easier when you have mental pictures in your head and are able to reference some of those things that you looked at to get you in the mood for that specific location. Now, besides getting a firm understanding of the goals, the most important thing that I found during the planning stage was making sure I had a good understanding of the different NPCs, who they were, where their main place of residence or working was, and their personality and motivations. If you know the character's motivations, you will be able to improv. And improv is key during this campaign because you don't know exactly where your players are going to go, which is part of the fun. If you want additional tips on improv, I have a video all about that. Thinking about the way these personalities interact in the world and having some key things that are different about each character is going to help keep it fresh. One of the mistakes I made was making all of the cult leaders pretty much the same. I felt like the descriptions in the actual campaign weren't great at differentiating the cult leaders because they all had the same motivation, and a lot of them were rich, high up in society, had a lot of power. So that made it really difficult to differentiate between them. So I think it's important you spend a little bit of time thinking about how you can make them a little bit different and intriguing for your players. The next NPC tips I have are regarding the newspapers. So this might sound a little bit weird, but when your players arrive in a location, newspapers are pretty much the first place they're going to get clues, information on history, but also current events if anything weird is happening. So the newspaper is almost always the first impression that the players get of the locations. It helps set the tone for the location, but it also gives you an opportunity to play around with different characters and have fun, because the newspaper people are usually not integral to the rest of the thread or the rest of the stories. They're just there to give some clues and information. So for example, I had a ton of fun in China of having my newspaper person be super hyper. All my players were suspecting that he was on drugs of some sort, which was fun for them to kind of go down that path and see what was going on. So my newspaper person was really, really excited and talked really, really fast and was able to get to know all the players and give them information. I was really excited that they're there and ended up going back and forth with one of the players, so it gave them a chance to role play, and it was fantastic. In addition to my fast-talking newspaper man, I also had someone in Kenya, and it gave me an opportunity to practice some different accents. I am not very good at accents, but there was one that I was attempting to do, and it gave me an opportunity to just play around and have a little bit of fun and keep it fresh. Like, mix it up and do something fun for these different characters. Great, now we have the goals. We have a clear understanding of the NPC's motivations and different personality quirks. And then I also have a good idea of how to describe the setting for my players and make each of the locations unique. The other thing I'm going to note about all of the locations is that the side quests are a ton of fun, and I recommend you play through all of them. So you might be tempted to shorten the campaign, get rid of the side quests, and just do the main storyline, which is a fine way to do it, but I personally had some of my greatest memories from this campaign from the side quests, like curing a family curse, fighting a cat demon, and making someone an orphan. Ooh, maybe not great on that one, but you get the point. The main thing is it broke up the main line of investigation, so it helped keep it a little bit fresh and helped keep players interested and a little bit of a break from kind of the main cult line. Let's talk about keeper screens. So you have two options. You have the keeper screen that came with Masks of Nyarlathotep, and then you have the core Call of Cthulhu keeper screen that comes with the starter kit, if that's something that you have. And basically, between the two, I much prefer the regular Call of Cthulhu keeper screen. Although this is absolutely gorgeous, I love the art on it, the information inside wasn't exactly helpful. You have key non-player characters all listed by name and the different things about them, But this is so overwhelming that it's not helpful during play. I wouldn't sit down and go and search for the specific person. So I never really felt like I need to use that. In addition, you would have the Carlisle expedition principles, some travel times, how to learn a new skill and development, which those things weren't very useful for in-game. The characters were, but I have those printed out anyway because they have the actual descriptions with them. So this I didn't find very useful during the game. Instead, this has so much information about your damage, chase scenes, any core rules that you would need to reference are easily accessible on this keeper screen. And this was much more helpful for me. We already talked about taking notes to prepare for play, but make sure you're also taking notes during play. In particular, my major recommendation is to take a couple bullet points about where the party ended. Sometimes I would be so tired by the end of the session that I didn't feel like doing a little wrap up, but I think it's going to be very helpful for you to remember while you're planning for the next session. In addition, with our group, we kind of took an unexpected break of about 2 months. So by the time I got around to planning, I had not taken follow-up notes or recap from the last session, and it got me in a little bit of trouble. I mean, I just reached out to my players and asked, but I think it's better if you have that information for yourself. Speaking of recaps, it's really important that you have your players actually recap the session when they start play, because that's going to give them an opportunity to remember what happened, tell a couple stories, and really get involved. So put the onus on your players to do the recap and talk about everything that happened and the clues that they have and where they're headed next when you start the session. Speaking of clues, there's a ton of them. So I basically started something about halfway through the campaign towards the end, which I think was the appropriate time to start doing this, by organizing some of the clues for your players. This is specifically going to a new location. Organize all of the relevant clues for that location. And you know that information from the clue diagrams provided in the book. Your players might not be able to easily recognize which clues are relevant for the location they're going to, but you as the keeper can give them a little bit of a head start to be able to give them guidance on where they're going and what they should be focusing on. Because one of the main things that's a struggle with this is making sure your players understand the whole thread of everything. It seems obvious to you as a keeper because you've spent so long reading these books, but to the players it can be a bit convoluted, and all of the different NPCs can be overwhelming and they might not be able to keep track of everyone. So making sure that you have a little bit of organizations and give your players a little bit of hints and heads up is helpful for everyone to enjoy the story and the campaign. The last thing to add about during play is it's okay to expand a little bit and add your own flavor to the locations. So obviously there's a ton of content, so it's not like you're short on that. But the things in these books can be really inspiring. There's some pretty cool stuff that happens and cool enemies that are encountered. So I find myself actually wanting to add a little bit more and wanting to explore different things because it's fun and it's inspiring. So for example, in England, there is a side plot revolving serpent people. One of my players actually got bit by this serpent person. And instead of it just being one and done, this bite was actually going and spreading throughout his body and slowly turning him into a serpent person. Turns out the cure was in Australia. So that's a way that I was able to lead my players to Australia, make that an important country. And it was also a way to connect the locations and have a little bit more fun with this side quest. Also, some great memories about a forest that caused hallucinations. Yeah, that caused a player death, but it was a lot of fun. So making sure that you're taking the time to have fun yourself and explore the different things you can do in each of these different locations. I wanted to wrap it up with some overall campaign expectations. So I had 5 PC deaths, 4 people go insane, and then several times where my players opted to change characters when they changed locations, which honestly was a ton of fun because it was a way for them to experience the locations a little bit differently, and again, just another way to freshen up the campaign and keeping it alive for that long time frame. Since this is an open world campaign, it means that your players do not need to go in the order that the countries are listed in the book. So this can present some challenges, but I overall felt like I was able to navigate this pretty easily. So the ordering in the book goes Peru, America, England, Egypt, Kenya, Australia, and China. Here's the order of locations that my players ended up going in. Peru, America, England, China, Australia, Egypt, Kenya. So as you can see, certainly not the order they had in the book. But they have tips for being able to move the grand conclusion to whatever your final location is. And overall, your players might get some clues out of order or might go to China and get a ton of information since there's a lot of plot points there, but they're still able to enjoy the different parts of the locations because there's different cult leaders in all of these countries. I also wanted to include my personal ranking of each of the locations in terms of enjoyment. So how much fun we have, how much plot was unraveled, all the different things that went into preparing the locations. I think my players kind of came pretty close to this ranking, so overall we were pretty aligned with how much we enjoyed each of the locations. I did not include Peru in this because it's kind of its own separate thing and not in the same realm as these other locations. So just looking at the core, my ranking is China, England, Egypt, America, Kenya, and Australia. So if you're considering reducing this campaign to only a few locations, I've pinpointed the 3 that I think are most important for you to play. And it's probably the order that your players should go in as well. So America would be first. It sets the stage for the different things that are happening and starts getting clues into this cult world. England has a ton of great information and understanding of the Penhew Foundation, the different expeditions that were happening, and the background behind everything. So there's a ton of plot points in England. And then for your grand conclusion, I would recommend China. This was the most fun location. There's a ton of information going on, a ton of plot points, and really I think is essential for this campaign to be as successful as it is. Now, my final keeper tip is to make sure that you are tracking your points for the grand conclusion as you go. On page 621, there's different locations and each of the different things that can happen at the locations and how many points your players would get for each of those things. So make sure as you're finishing up the location, you're keeping track of that, maybe circling the ones that apply, so that at the end, when you get to the grand conclusion, you can kind of give that overall final view of everything that happened. Those are the key things that a keeper should be considering before starting this campaign and preparing and what they need to tell their players. There's a lot of stuff that goes into prepping this, but it's totally worth it, and I hope you have a ton of fun with it. Next, I'm going to be working on deep dives for each of the individual locations, keeper tips, things to do differently, things that are most important on each of these locations. So if you don't want to miss that, make sure you're subscribed. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.